I hear my guest here. Let me go to him. We are joined with Tim Anderson. Tim, how you doing, man? You doing okay tonight?
Hi, Jamal. Thanks. Yeah, just recovering from a bit of jet lag.
Oh, yes. Oh, well, can we? Okay, I'm not gonna bring it up. I never know whether I can mention this stuff
It's okay.
on the show. Okay, but I'm glad you're back, and I'm glad you're back safely. So, and yeah, you're what 6, 7 hours in regards to the location. So yeah. Tim Anderson, he's a writer, internationalist, academic, director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies. And you can find him, counter-hegemonic studies, that site. Tim, I am super excited that you are with me because I'm also looking for a little bit of insight. So, of course, we're still dealing with the ramifications of Israel's attack on Doha, murdering several Hamas members, apparently murdering another Qatari that was there. So Qatar comes out and says this. Now, just to be clear, they are also having a meeting with, I think they call it the OIC, Organization of basically Muslim Arab States. Yeah. And so Iran is also at this particular meeting. Egypt is at this meeting. They have Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. All of these groups are there. And all of them are trying to come to some kind of consensus on some kind of, let's say, strategy or plan in order to push back on Israel. Now that they seem to have come to an assessment that they are talking about greater Israel openly, we are all subject to attack. The United States in no way is going to step in and rein in his dog. And we need to do something for ourselves since we know that the U.S. is not going to, let's say, fulfill the bargain of oil for protection. So this is Prime Minister making his initial statement. If I can flip this over, there we are. This is him making his initial statement, effectively saying something needs to be done. We can't allow this to go unresponded to.
Article 4, and within this context, we express our appreciation to the Arab states who condemned this Israeli barbaric attack and their support to the lawful measures we will take to safeguard our sovereignty. Attacking Qatar's sovereignty is a violation of the UN Charter, namely Article 4, prohibits the use of force against countries and its sovereignty. It is also a flagrant violation of the international norms and humanitarian tenets. It cannot be an isolated incident that can go unpunished.
I'm fascinated by this, that A, they're still talking about international law. Israel's committing a genocide, and these guys are like, hey, this is breaking international law. B, Syria has, the Gulf states have given all sorts of money, billions of dollars, to overthrow the Syrian government, which, again, also breaches international law. He didn't necessarily care about it in that context. And we've watched Israel kill, murder, rape, occupy Syria, occupy Lebanon. They're doing the occupation of Lebanon and Syria right now, demanding territory from both. But he seems legitimately outraged on the fact that his country was personally attacked.
I think
give me an overall take as we step into this.
I think that's because they didn't expect. After all, Qatar hosts the biggest U.S. military base in the whole region, right? Now they expected they were going to be safe behind all of the air defense that the U.S. has and Qatar has too, and Qatar pays a lot of money to the U.S. for whatever it has. But they were all switched off that time. And what the Israelis attacked was a residential area of Doha, whereas what the Iranians attacked in retaliation for the US attack on Iran was some radar installations within the military base. So the Israelis went much further. They were betrayed by Trump as well as attacked by the Israelis, and they didn't expect this because, pardon me, both the Israelis and the US had asked them to host talks with Hamas. So there's a huge amount of betrayal, genuine anger, because they really thought that it can't happen to us. They'll attack other people but not us. And now it sent a message to all of the oil-rich monarchies or the petro-monarchies in the Persian Gulf that you're not safe by hosting US bases. The Emirates have had some planes there and so on. So all of them have been very close collaborators with the US, but Qatar the most, basically. And so I think the anger is genuine on the one hand. Of course, the hypocrisy is clear, as you pointed out. It's mainly Qatar that was funding the HTS regime, which is now in power in Damascus, basically. so for many years through Turkey, and that regime in Damascus is now saying its main enemies are Iran and Hezbollah, nicely, coincidentally, the same enemies as the Israelis. But now, of course, you see what's happened is that a little bit like the Saudi attack on Qatar in 2017, which was really a war of jealousy really between them, because Qatar is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a secret society which has power in Turkey with Mr. Erdogan and in Qatar, and briefly they had a Muslim Brotherhood president in Egypt. And the core of the Syrian insurrection back in 2011 was really Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, then supported by internationalist jihadis from all different countries, basically. So when that happened in 2017, it was Iran that gave asylum effectively to Qatar in terms of finance, in terms of airspace and so on. And then there was, in other words, Qatar was pushed into the arms of Iran back then when the Saudis, when MBS in Saudi Arabia attacked them. And now it's happened again, basically, because the Israelis attacked Iran in June, and now they're attacking Qatar. So the Iranians are are on a diplomatic offensive, expressing their solidarity with Qatar. And Qatar is also warning the other Gulf states of their vulnerability. The Emirates have already cancelled the Israeli participation in the Dubai Air Show in November, and Qatar is trying to pressure them to close the embassy in the Emirates. The Emirates has, in the meantime, been kicking out many Shia Muslims from the Emirates, fearing that they're going to cause problems for the Iranians through their sympathies with Hezbollah. So there's been a purge in the Emirates, but now it's thrown things up in the air, and there's a lot of anxiety in these Persian Gulf monarchies, where people thought they were safe from the fallout of this war. They thought it was all going on between Israel and Iran and not them.
Do you think they're going to do anything? Is the interesting question to me. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they don't want to act singularly. They seem to we want everybody to be involved in any action that takes place.
Yes.
Egypt has went so far as to say that they want a NATO-style arrangement with the other countries in the region. What do you think this response is going to be, and do you think these countries are going to come to some consensus on a response?
Well, Qatar was a non-NATO member, but ally, and so had some sort of status in NATO terms, because precisely it's the biggest base in the region. It's the center of CENTCOM. The Pentagon is supposed to control the whole of West Asia, most of the Middle East from Qatar, basically, and attacks on countries could be launched from there, as well as from Diego Garcia with the long-range bombers. So I don't think Qatar is in very deep. They are Muslim Brotherhood. That's why they had links with some of the Palestinian resistance groups when they were Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas has really broken from the Muslim Brotherhood and sided back to the resistance. That's why its main sponsor is Iran these days. That was a controversial move when they broke from Iran back in 2012. But that's all changed. Nevertheless, as I said, Hamas was hosting these talks in Doha at the request of the Israelis and the US, because the US felt if we don't have one of our allies or collaborators, then Hamas is only going to be have relations with Iran. It's going to be all through Iran, basically. So they didn't want Iran to have that monopoly of contact, and now we see that they've used it. They've used this office of negotiations to box them in and try and kill them all. So how many people have they betrayed? Of course, they betrayed Hamas, they betrayed Qatar, and they've sent a strong message to the other collaborators that no one is safe there, basically. So it will tend to push them into a more friendly position with Iran and with Iran's allies. But I don't think Qatar is going to break out, but it's going to look for some sort of support, of course. It's already pushing certainly the Emirates in that direction. They don't always see things eye to eye, but nevertheless, they're both part of the Gulf Council, the GCC, and it'll have an effect on the members of the GCC who are normally very staunch US. I hesitate to say allies, because they're not really allies, but they're allied to the US in some subordinate sort of way. It will make them be more cautious about their collaboration. I'll try and back off a little bit. Even the Emirates did it when there was some attacks on Yemen, and the Emirates didn't want the US airplanes in the Emirates. I think they kicked them out to Qatar because they didn't want the Yemenis to be firing back at them again. The Yemeni can hit the Emirates with their missiles. So you can see that they tend to back off. They try and reposition themselves so that they won't be a target. That's certainly going to happen. I mean, they've all been collaborating with Israel, all of these Gulf monarchies. It's just that only some of them have come out openly. What is it? Bahrain and the Emirates to formally recognize under the Abraham Accords. But the Saudis have been intervening to help them intercept missiles from Yemen and from Iran and so on. Jordan has been doing the same sort of thing, you know. So all of those subordinate Arab regimes who consider themselves allies of the US have been doing their bit to help the Israelis, but now they see that that's not going to give them any guarantee of security.
Yeah. So Donald Trump, apparently the prime minister on the head said, hey, this won't happen again. I'll make sure of it. And as I keep pointing out, you have to trust the man that led people into waiting, you know, effectively led them through negotiations, or this idea of negotiations, and murdered them during attempted negotiations. Same thing with Soleimani, same thing with Iran, where they tried to decapitation strike. So I would imagine they don't, you know, that's worth nothing.
No, also, and he lied to them about that attack because he said it was Israel and he didn't have advance notice, and everyone knows he did because the US, which is a huge military base there, switched off its air defense. Otherwise, the air defense from the US and from Qatar would have been shooting at those Israeli planes.
Was this a strategic mistake by the US and by Israel? I mean, Israel is openly talking about Greater Israel at this point, which by definition means that many of these states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all of these states would have to give up territory for Israel to get their quote unquote Greater Israel. It's pretty ballsy to just come out and admit that. Like, they feel very confident at this point.
Yeah, they're emboldened. The Israelis are emboldened by Trump in particular because he's really removed the mask, hasn't he, really? I mean, with Biden was supporting the genocide, everyone knows that, but there was always this rhetoric, sort of facade of rhetoric and talk about rules-based orders and things like this, and Trump has thrown all that to one side. And no one knows exactly, you know, how far it's going to go, but the Israelis are talking much more openly. Even under Biden, there was an official under Biden who was saying similar things to Netanyahu, basically, and now some of the emissaries of Trump are talking about, with contempt, about as Trump did in his first term, really with contempt about the Gulf monarchies, you know, that they provide money to us and, you know, they wouldn't exist if we weren't protecting them, these sorts of things. So it's been, and that's why Biden couldn't get the Emiratis to pump more fuel for him when there was a fuel shortage after they'd sanctioned Russia, after Iran and after Venezuela, you know. So really Washington has been painting itself into a corner, but the rhetoric from Washington and the Israelis has become much more crude. And much more openly hostile, not just to their traditional enemies, but to these other Arab regimes, you know, that really, I think Netanyahu is saying, you know, we'll push them around and then we'll get them to agree to things and then we'll hit them over the head, you know. So the betrayal is spoken about more openly because of this arrogance, because if you keep getting away with anything, I mean, the Israelis have attacked they've bombed 10 countries in a week, was it? 10 countries? If you include Malta and Tunisia bombing the fleet, and now Qatar and Yemen and Syria, they're bombing the air defense that Erdogan has been giving to Jolani in Syria, you know. So there's an extraordinary level of violence and uncertainty in the region, and it's making the most conservative or the most reactionary of those regimes think twice about getting further into bed with this strategy. You know, that they'll want to save their ass basically and back out if they can to a safe position, if there is a safe position.
Yeah, see, and this is where I think I disagree with some of my guests, because some of my guests take this position. They're not going to do anything. These guys are vassals. They're going to vassal harder. They're not going to respond in any particular way. And I think the thing for me is like, yeah, but it has been made very clear through Netanyahu speeches, we're going to do this again. Through underlings of Netanyahu, we're going to do this again. Netanyahu is very clear. Anywhere that we believe that there is somebody who we want to murder, we will do so.
They're talking about attacking Turkey too. They're talking about attacking Turkey, yeah.
Yep, exactly my point. Like, meaning the moment that you're aware of that as a country, regardless, even if you're a vassal, and you're aware, okay, we could be hit at any moment. Any of us, all of us. The map of Greater Israel goes through our countries. Okay, maybe we should do something.
Well, Turkey is a NATO member, remember, and that's an interesting dilemma for NATO. But also Qatar has this associate membership, basically. So effectively, you know, if you talk about Ukraine being a dilemma for NATO, how are they going to react if a NATO member, Turkey, they've already attacked these defense installations that Turkey was giving to Jolani, you know. So effectively, NATO is being drawn into this one too by the Israelis, but the Israelis have been considered more or less European and some sort of associate member of NATO too. So it's not, of course, NATO does what Washington says. So Washington will just give the Israelis a blank blank check. But basically, I think it was a representative of Biden that was saying not too long ago that the the Israelis are going to be, the region's going to be swept, and the Israelis are going to be the overwhelming hegemon in the entire region, which is what Condoleezza Rice was saying almost 20 years ago when she made those statements about using creative chaos to reshape the region, basically. But it's coming out in the open more just under the Trump administration, I guess. And Netanyahu likes that.
Well, and therein lies the rub. I mean, the fact that they know this, on some level, I would imagine that, meaning it's one thing if you are a vassal and you feel comfortable in your status. We're protected. We're somehow different than these other countries that are being destroyed and murdered. When that reality is shattered, brimmingly shattered, like just clear as day shattered, then what? And doesn't that on some level inspire these countries to do something different because their safety is no longer a guarantee in any of this anymore? Meaning the entire premise by which they were operating has just gone up in smoke, and very clearly gone up in smoke. Do you think they will respond? Like, meaning,
yes, they will. They have already by having this meeting, this summit in Doha. I was passing through that as it happens, but I didn't actually see it or participate in it. But they've already done it, and they're going to look for some other options. They'll look for greater cooperation with some other Muslim countries, and they'll look for greater cooperation with Iran. And that's going to slow down the rhythm of these wars that's going on, basically. You know, the Israelis haven't got it all their own way. They're talking about a second attack on Iran, but I think that's been delayed because there's so many people that they're attacking, and their capabilities are not that great. They're depending on foreign shipment of arms and so on, just as you could say in a parallel way to the Ukrainian situation. You know, they wouldn't exist if they weren't getting this outside support. But nevertheless, they have ambitions to do all sorts of things. They want to attack Lebanon again. They want to attack Iraq. They want to eliminate the Yemeni threat. And they're talking about going back to Qatar, to finish off the lead negotiators in Hamas. They didn't manage to kill. Basically, they killed the son of one of them and the security guard and some other people in the delegation, but the main people they didn't kill. So they want to do all sorts of things, and they're talking about eliminating what they call the Iranian proxies in the region before they move back to Iran again. So my sense is that there was a lot of a growing consensus amongst analysts that they were going to move on a second attack on Iran soon, maybe this month. But that may be delayed now because they're still having trouble restocking all of those air defenses, and they've got so many other battles going on the side, and they're worried about getting hit from the side by Iran's allies if they go for Iran again, which stretches them. Of course, that's the one that stretches them the most, Iran, because Iran can hit back and hurt them, basically. And that's when they're vulnerable to the other resistance. You know, in Iraq, the resistance, to some extent in Lebanon, certainly in Yemen, there's a great possibility that they can be outflanked if they attempt another attack on Iran, and Iran manages to damage more of their infrastructure and more of their munitions.
But they never did that, though. Like, those other entities never got involved in fact, none of them got involved.
Iran asked them not to on the last occasion because Iran was talking about this gradual incremental increase in the munitions that they were using. Basically, it was a sort of diplomatic maneuver. Basically, they've been telling them now we've got a new generation of missiles and so on. So they asked the Yemenis specifically not to intervene at that time. But if the circumstances change, it'll be different. And Iran has been, the military commanders have been saying, we're gradually turning up the temperature, and if they try it again, we're going to come in harder, basically. And come in harder may mean that they're going to have volleys coming from the side as well.
What do the Gulf states have to lose in their relationship with the U.S. at this point? I mean, they're not at war with Iran. They're not even in competition in the sense of, Iranian proxies going after these countries. So this notion of needing protection for oil doesn't necessarily seem to apply. And protection at this point is off the table in real terms. So what do they have to lose by
protection means something very different to the US and its worldview and CENTCOM than it does to them, basically. Of course, let's remember the Emirates are already in BRICS. The Saudis have an invitation to BRICS, but they haven't joined yet. Right. Iran's in BRICS, so they've got, of course, the Saudis want access to the Chinese market and the Emiratis too. So, so there's those markets, but they, you're right, they're boxed in many respects. They can't and they fear. I think they fear Washington. They always fear Washington. To some extent, the Israelis do too, because the Israelis are emboldened because they think we managed to attack Iran directly and we survived the counterattack and we got Washington to join in at the end. And even though they got hurt and they got a lot of things damaged, there's this sense that they achieved some of their goals there, basically. But
Right.
you know, the Israelis still, they have this fear in the background. There's always been this paranoia that at one time the US is not going to be there for them, basically. As you know, for example, remember with Georgia, what was it, back in 2008 when the Georgian president, whatever his name was, attacked Russia over some breakaway sections there,
Yes.
and expected George Bush to get involved, and Bush said, no, you're on your own, basically.
Yeah.
So the Israelis always have this background fear, even though Biden backed them up, even though Trump backed them up, there's still this fear that if things get really tough, you know, where's Big Brother, basically. So they have that sort of fear. And of course, that's a much greater fear with the Gulf monarchies, you know, basically, because I think we don't want to be in the crossfire between Yemen or Israel and Iran, for example. But they could well be, and because they all host US facilities in some respects, and the Iranians are going to attack those facilities and try to avoid too many US casualties, because the Iranians don't want a big pretext for massive retaliation by the US. So you see, that's why they're treading cautiously in a sense, because they don't want to. No one wants escalation. No serious person wants escalation in a war, basically. So on the times when they've retaliated against the US, it's been at facilities. And remember the second strike that Iran did on Israelis, it was only at their facilities, and now they're actually hitting things. They haven't been killing as many people as Israelis did. I was in Iran just recently, and they took us to see the houses of the nuclear scientists who were killed in the first day of that attack back in June, basically. And what they did was effectively demolish a whole apartment block and killed a man and his whole family, and then about 4 or 5 or 6 neighbors as well. So it was a devastating, you know, brutal attack on people who were civil servants, you know, scientists, basically, because they were linked in some way to the nuclear program. The Israelis just thought they could go and murder them, basically. So they can do that. That sort of crossfire can happen to the Gulf monarchies too. They all have some sort of US facilities there.
No, I get that part. I guess what I'm asking, God, that brings up 2 points. If everything Iran did up to this point has shown itself to create the context by which Israel attacks them and go for decimation strikes. I mean, Israel was trying to murder human beings. Yeah. Iran was trying to have this kind of ethical war. Has their strategy been somewhat of a faux pas? I mean, Israel's looking at this kind of like, these guys are weak. They are, we won. I think they still have this idea that they won in all of this. Yeah. And the Gulf monarchies, I guess my thing is, they have no natural enemies in that region short of Israel. Iran is not trying to attack them. So what is the protection that they're getting out of this?
Well, Iran has threatened to destroy the oil facilities in the Gulf, let's remember, and put a blockade on the Gulf. So their economies are under threat in that sort of way. So it's not that easy for them. Okay. They're worried about that. They're worried about their economies being damaged. Of course, even when Iran acts in a more gentlemanly manner, they let Qatar know, for example, hours in advance when they were striking the Israelis, so that Qatar could cancel the flights there. I happened to be traveling through the Gulf at that time, and all the Qatar flights were cancelled for a few hours in the morning, basically, and then they came back on in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, Iran was very civilized in that sort of way, you know, old school rules of war type of thing. Whereas the Israelis do sneak attacks, as they did on Qatar, you know, so sneak attacks, and then they kill civilians, and they attack residential civilian areas, and then they say, you know, of course they lie about it, basically. But things are not that simple. I think there's a great deal of nervousness in the Gulf at the moment. The Emirates obviously didn't want the Israeli military in Dubai in November, pardon me.
Right.
But so they cancelled that there, even though beforehand they were being very protective of the Israeli presence in Dubai, but it's caused problems for them, a lot of social problems for them there. So there's some response already going on. I don't know whether they're going to close the Israeli consulate. It might be a symbolic thing they would do. Qatar is pressing them to do that. Pardon me.
You're fine. You're fine.
So I think they're going to respond in some sorts of ways. And it's significant that the OIC had the meeting in Qatar, because you've got these other important states, Malaysia and Indonesia and so on, that have some weight in the world, and it's going to harden their position basically, and as I said, drive them into the arms of Iran too. So that'll be a problem for the US, because the US, with its so-called sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, they're really attempts to isolate their targets, and principally it's been Iran, because Iran is the biggest, even though a lot of people in the West don't understand it. Iran is the biggest by far partner of the Palestinian resistance, and really it's likely that the Palestinian people would not exist if they hadn't had this constant support for 47 years. 46 years from Iran, basically. So that accounts for all of the propaganda about Iran from the Israelis since at least the 90s, if not the 80s. It was the Israelis who were pushing for the invasion of Iraq and all the rest of it, and now they pushed the Australians recently into breaking relations with Iran on completely fake pretexts. So
Right.
they're the ones that have been pushing this, and of course Washington is on the same page when it comes to trying to isolate the rivals to Israeli hegemony in the region, which is what they want.
I would like to show you an article. You flagged this on your own channel, and I think it's interesting. So this is by The Cradle. Goodbye, War on Terror. Hello, War on Arab Sovereignty.
Yeah, very good article.
Yeah, the Cradle does really good work.
Yeah,
So
Ali Ahmad, I think he's based in Turkey, but he's working for some think tanks. Yeah, very good overview of the change in the strategy of the US.
Yeah, so effectively he's making the argument like the war on terror is effectively over, and this notion of having these sovereign monarchs, that is in question, that is no longer a given in the way that it was given prior. And the attack that took place on Doha is kind of a warning of sorts, or a new norm in the way of operations in regards to Washington and Israel. Israel is going to be the dominant force in the region. The other countries are going to be subordinate powers to Israeli dominance. Give me your take on that. Is that effectively what I think that Doha attack was indicating?
And he's saying that, well, the war on terror was always a nonsense anyway, really. I mean, what's a war on the adjectival noun? What does that even mean? The greatest terrorists in the region are the Israelis, basically, and the US has been funding that for decades, but what he's saying is that this idea that there's going to be some attempt to, which is the pretext for most US interventions across West Asia and North Africa. In North Africa, we've got the similar sort of thing going on with Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and so on. These are Salafi Wahhabi groups funded by these Gulf monarchies, basically, because the ideology of Wahhabism comes from Saudi Arabia and the Salafists, similarly, with this very sectarian fanaticism. It's being used to divide and rule people, and then the US comes in and says, we'll help you fight terrorism. That's how they got back into, US military got back into Iraq, even though the Iraqis have been trying to get them out, in recent years. And apparently there's some moves happening at the moment. I don't know how secure they are, but Iraq is suffering under this occupation still after more than 20 years after the invasion. So, the article is saying very credibly that there's no attempt to talk about creating stability in the region by eliminating terrorism. Now, it's about, they want a network of entirely weak states. They don't want any strong Arab regime. And that's what they did in Syria. They got rid of a relatively strong, although, weakened by years of war and siege and so on. They got rid of a relatively stable regime, and inclusive, I might add, regime. And they put an ISIS commander in charge, and then invited him to New York to talk to the United Nations almost on the anniversary of 9/11, when everyone still thinks it was Al-Qaeda that attacked the Twin Towers there. So they want to destabilize all the countries like Syria and have a weak network. That's the only way that a small entity like the Israelis could possibly dominate the region.
Mm-hmm.
And that article by Ali Ahmadi makes it very clear. I think it's a very good perspective, actually, that it's a shift, at least in their rhetoric. Perhaps they always wanted that anyway, because, of course, the textbook is really Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard from the 90s, which is about destroying nodes of power around the world. Particularly talks about Eurasia and Europe, but they mean the Middle East, West Asia as well. So Ali Ahmadi's article just spells it out that really they don't want any strong Arab regime, any strong Arab nationalist or any other sort of regime is going to be a threat to them, basically. So that means they're going to make them all pathetic, weak, divided or warring little entities like they did with Libya and then Syria. And that includes And that includes allies, so-called allies.
Well, I hope they know that. That's the fascinating part to me, that they thought they were special. They thought they were different.
Yeah.
They're not. I mean, you have a country that's been murdering Arabs for years. And for whatever reason, it's like, oh, but we're special in all of this. And then they take umbrage the moment that they get hit. I'm fascinated by that dynamic, to be honest.
Well, it works at home, doesn't it? You know, someone gets killed in the US and everyone's talking about it for ages and ages. And meantime, another 50 children are killed, you know, almost every day in Gaza, and it goes off the front pages, doesn't it? And one local murder takes its place.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's almost like the world got used to the genocide. It's like, yeah, this takes place every day, but man, Doha doesn't get hit every day. So we need to talk about this. We need to make this a big deal. No, you're absolutely right. It's just fascinating the way it's transpired. I mean, if you're sitting somewhere looking on the moon and you're just kind of looking at events and you're like, wow, that country has impunity to do whatever it wants. And then it uses that same impunity to do whatever it wants.
Keeps going.
And they're shocked by it.
Unless they get punished, unless they get slapped down in some way, they keep doing it and they keep growing it. Yeah.
But they never get punished and they never get slapped down. And I'm unaware of any entity that is willing to do that, short of. Let me ask you this: if Doha gets hit again, will they respond militarily at that point?
No, I don't think they're capable of it, because obviously the US military has its hands on the switches. Otherwise, they're air defense. I mean, Qatar has air defense as well as the US base in Qatar. You know, it's separate. They didn't activate it at all. So, pardon me. However, whether by remote control or whatever, their air defense was switched off, and they could have hit anyone there, basically. And they did actually hit anyone. I imagine they haven't talked about it. They talked about one Qatari security guard, but what about all the neighbors when they hit residential buildings? In Iran, I saw there was almost equal number of neighbors killed when they went in to murder one scientist, you know, and family members and so on.
So at the end of the day, all of this is talk. It's Qatar trying to find allies, trying to get friends, trying to get other people involved.
Well, they will look for support elsewhere. They will look for some refuge somewhere else. And the first place they're going to look is Iran. The first place they're going to look is Iran, because Iran has helped them. Qatar hasn't responded very helpfully, because they, of course, funded the terrorists that overthrew Iran's ally in Syria. But nevertheless, Iran diplomatically is very accommodating in that sort of way. They're very clever. They did give refuge to Qatar, even though the Qatari media, you know, they ran terrible things about Shia Muslims, really like genocidal sectarian stuff by some people they put on Al Jazeera. It was awful stuff. But nevertheless, when Qatar was in trouble, the Iranians in 2017, the Iranians accommodated them and supported them in some way. And now they came out of that crisis with their big brother, the Saudis, you know, and supposedly they're working together again. But
you know, it's funny. I was in Qatar when they were bombing Qatar.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't on purpose. My ex-wife and I were traveling. We just so happened to land in Doha. We were in I think it was like a 12-15 hour overlap where we just kind of toured. And when talking to the cab driver, he was talking about how there was bombing on the outskirts. There was an issue between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And yeah, it was fascinating to be, you know, part of that. One last question on this: are negotiations off? I mean, there's no way that Qatar is going to be suckered into having additional negotiations under this model where they realize they're not safe, or are they?
Well, Hamas is going to think twice about it, obviously. That's the first thing. I mean, Hamas has other options, basically. But the reason they were in Qatar was that the US didn't want Iran to have a monopoly on hosting Qatar, you know, and it's going to be, of course, you know, the Israelis got away with murdering some people with Iran without too much retaliation. But nevertheless, they certainly have greater protection. There are Hamas people in Iran, and they have greater protection there. So Hamas will think twice about that. Because the Israelis have already said arrogantly that they're going to go back and try and finish off, because they failed, basically. They failed to destroy the negotiating team. It seems like they want some trophy to hold up, because in the past they were saying that the analysts were saying the Israelis want to hit Iran again and pretend that they've destroyed its nuclear facilities before October the 7th, before their anniversary, because Netanyahu's looking for some sort of trophy to hold up and say, look what we've achieved with all this endless war. Everyone knows Netanyahu has to keep the war going in some way, but he wants something to hold up, and the destruction of the entire Hamas leadership. They won't do really, because they won't do that even because on the field they've recruited as many young people as they've lost in the last decade. I think the US military admitted that some months ago, basically, that they'd lost many fighters. They'd lost perhaps more than 15,000 fighters, but they recruited the same numbers again. And the same goes for Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front and the Fatah armed groups too. So, but the leadership, it's some sort of symbolic thing that Netanyahu's reaching to try and say, look, we got rid of all of the big known leaders of Hamas, and here's something to hold up to try and support his image that he's actually achieving something. Because the Israelis are weary of the war too. It's hurting them, and if they get another volley from Iran, there'll be some serious crying going on.
Are they overstretched?
They are overstretched, but of course they're overstretched. I mean, they're only going on with these offensive because the US and Britain, which of course logistically supported that attack. Have you seen the flights that the British had refueling aircraft circling Qatar at that time, and Trump obviously knew about it because I said they switched off all the air defenses around the US base, which is on the it's not near Doha, it's on the outskirts, so it's a fair distance from Doha, with different air defense there basically. So they know that they were involved. The Germans seem to be pulling back a little bit on their supply of weapons, but you don't know how much of it is doublespeak really. But a number of the Europeans are now saying, Spain is saying, maybe Slovenia, but the big suppliers like Germany are starting to talk about pulling back the weapons while the slaughter's going on in Gaza, basically. So all of this scandal is having some impact on their sponsors, but nevertheless, the US and the UK are the core of it, basically. What the Israelis care most are the Anglo-Americans, who were their mother and father and their ongoing sponsors, basically. And the propaganda war, of course, in the English-speaking media.
Yeah. I have a clip that I would like to get your take on. So, yeah, we have time. All right. This is Al-Shara, Al-Jalani, whatever he wants to go by at this point. Listen to what he says here. And I want to get your take on this, because this has been a pretty big contention on my channel among various guests. And he gives, I'm going to have Dan Kovalik on Friday. Dan Kovalik wrote the book. Dan and Jeremy Kuzmarov wrote the book on Syria, basically how it collapsed, how it declined, and everything else. It just came out. And so they're going to give this kind of rundown on it. But this has been a permanent argument on this channel among various people on how it collapsed and how it fell apart, and the Russia's role involved, and for that matter, Iran's role.
Yeah.
This is Jalani. Listen to what he says here, because he's bringing in a key point.
وصلنا إلى حماة في المعركة التحرير، فجرت مفاوضات بيننا وبين روسيا مع الروس نعم. فعند وصولنا إلى حمص، الروس في هذا الوقت ابتعدوا عن المعركة، يعني انسحبوا تماما من المشهد العسكري اللي كان بقصف الطائرات أو ما إلى ذلك، يعني ضمن اتفاق جرى بيننا وبينهم. فهذا أثر بشكل إيجابي على المعركة. فنحن بذاك الوقت الروس أعطوا التزامات معينة لسوريا الحالية، ونحن أيضا أعطينا التزامات، فنحن وفينا بها ووفوا بهم إلى هذه اللحظة. فلم يبدو منهم أي تدخل سلبي في الشأن السوري، بالعكس كان هناك يعني تفاعل إيجابي خلال الفترات الماضية. بالنسبة لإيران لا، الجرح كان أعمق بعض الشيء.
All right, I'm not going to play all of it, but I think the point is clear.
Yeah,
he's effectively saying, because people have been confused about how is Russia still there? How does Russia still have that military base there, especially with the U.S. Influence, Turkey's influence in the region, and yet they seem to be making some kind of agreement with his government in order to maintain a military base there and even deal with them almost as trading partners of sorts. He points out that during the war, I guess we can call it a war, that at a certain point, Russia made a deal with his forces to stop and pull back and to not attack. And in doing so, to effectively, we'll make an agreement not to attack. You make an agreement with us, I guess, for after all of this is over with, in which case both sides kept their agreements.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, this kind of...
Totally plausible what he's saying there, even though he's not a trustworthy person. But I think it's quite plausible that they did that. But what's most important to me is the timing. You see, he says when they reached Hama, they started talking to them. Now, the deal was cut with the Syrian army commanders, or the corruption of the Syrian army command was a done deal by then. And I'm pretty sure that Russia was close enough to the Syrian army command to know that it was over there. The Russian calculation was essentially similar to the Iranians from a different position. Iran had actually saw it coming and offered Assad some military support, and Assad distanced himself from it. He was trying to distance himself from Iran at that time. But Russia was with their base there, naval and air base. They saw what was happening, and my reading is that they did the best of a bad situation. They saw that if the Syrian army wasn't going to fight, they couldn't save them, basically. I know there's a lot of bad feeling in Syria at the moment about the Russians because they feel they could have done more. But basically, the Russians were never prepared to take the place of the Syrian Arab Army. It was a Syrian Arab Army with Russian air support mostly that did most of the liberation of cities, after 2015. But remember, the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan for a period of time, and effectively it supplanted the role of the former Afghan regime at that time, basically. And then it was a losing war for them, basically, because it was seen to be an occupation force, basically. Putin was aware of that, and Russia didn't go into Syria with the idea that he was going to replace the Syrian army. So if the majority of the army command had been purchased by Qatar and Turkey, obviously, Qatar were the money bags, and Turkey was channeling it, through their people along that border and their relations with HTS. I believe that Russia simply had to quickly move to make the best of that situation, hang on to their base. They evacuated Assad. They evacuated the loyal army commanders to Russia, but they avoided the Syrian army having some infighting, some civil war, because the majority of the command had told the troops to pull back, and the Russians couldn't countermand that, basically. So they weren't part of. If the timing were that he had talks with them the week before, it would have been different. But because he says when they reached Hama, it was clear by then that something was going on in the Syrian army, that they weren't going to put up. There was only a bit of sporadic resistance, basically, from Aleppo to Hama. So my reading is that they got drawn into that deal after the deal was done, in terms of the corruption of the Syrian army command. I know there's other people with conspiracy theories about Russia, going to some alliance with Syria. I don't believe that. It's true that, with the Israelis. It's true that Russia always had a different relationship with the Israelis. They weren't prepared to have any fight with the Israelis, but they were, and the Hezbollah and Syria recognized this. They went in to help them with those terrorist groups. There was no ideological fight with the US over that, because the US was theoretically fighting the Al Qaeda groups and ISIS while they were helping them, basically. But so Russia went in without an ideological challenge, but also with a very clear aim not to replace the role of the Syrian Arab Army to the end, until I think that the army itself, they would have kept fighting had the many of these traitors in the army not been purchased, basically. And most of those traitors, by the way, are still in Syria, either in Damascus or in some country area of Tartus, where they are still working with Gilani's regime, with intelligence about where things are, and also certain people that even some of the traitors were themselves individually linked to massacres of the terrorist groups there, Gilani's groups. I mean, anyone who was working with the Syrian army against HTS, against ISIS, has become a target. But some of those who were involved in those actions are now collaborators, so they have some relative safety so long as they're an asset to the Gilani regime. But the problem is, of course, the Gilani regime doesn't really control the country yet. There's certain areas that are excluded, and there's no real sense of a nation that he's able to build. This is what the one of the Palestinian resistance people told me, who was in Damascus. Says these people, they can't build a homeland. They can't make people feel part of a homeland there. And of course, the Kurds are still up in the air over there. Their Turkish ally has fallen apart. The Druze are very worried, and some of them want protection from the Israelis, so that the country is a real mess, and Gilani's not able to establish a stable regime there, which is what the US wants, basically. You look at Ali Ahmadi's article, that's what he's saying there. That's the sort of thing they want, a Libya-style solution. Even Iraq was superior in a way, because Iraq has been trying to gradually regain some sort of sovereignty since 2003. Every now and then, the US will try and demonize or push out, like they pushed out al-Maliki, because he was trying to be a little bit independent, but the US has got its claws into the Iraqi economy. They control the finances. They provide all this expensive military equipment, which they control too, because US military equipment is really never given freely to others, as we saw in Qatar. Basically, probably they got the back door to the Qatari air defense and just switched it off, basically. But Iraq is recovering, although they got federalized, which weakened them. They're recovering some sort of political will, but they're still trying to kick out the US occupation, which doesn't let them do all sorts of things.
Yeah, I agree with you on the Syria thing. When I talk to people who are, let's say, very boisterous about the idea that Russia just abandoned Syria, I like to point out that obviously Russia wanted to maintain that relationship. There was no win for them to lose the relationship with the previous government, considering what they've invested in that government. It sounds like, I agree with you, that when things got to the point of their military is melting away, what do we do?
I mean, there's resentment in Syria for some real reasons. There was always resentment that Russia hadn't provided the state-of-the-art air defense, even though they did provide air defense, and it was a deterrent to the Israelis. They shot down one plane and they stopped the Israelis flying over Syrian airspace. Now with Jelani, they're flying over Syrian airspace to attack Iran, and they'll use it to attack Iraq as well, and they use it to attack Qatar. So there was resentment over that. And then also because the big massacres back in March on the coast near Jableh were very close to the Russian base, and the Russians didn't intervene, or rather there was a small intervention. They gave out some weapons to people, said they were coming back, and they didn't. They didn't help people, the communities there on the coast, defend themselves. But then they took in refugees into the airbase, and I believe a number of them are still there. So there was a lot of ambiguous responses there, but it was a lot of ad hocery going on. I believe it's best understood as the Russians just trying to make the best of a very bad situation. Maybe some people on the base wanted to help the local people around Jableh, and maybe they were countermanded. I don't know exactly what's going on there. And the people in Russia are not talking, of course, because I think that's probably Putin's deal in terms of political asylum, as it was with the former president of Ukraine. What's his name? Back from 2004.
Yanukovych. Yeah.
Like Assad is in the same situation, I believe. He can live in Russia, and he'll have to learn Russian, but they're not going to let him use Russia as a political platform. I think they've done that to all of the generals, all of the senior Syrian army officers who were there too, because they're not communicating very well. Only with some family members are they communicating.
Basically, you can come here, but you can't use us as a political. This is not a government in exile.
I think they tried to do it with Snowden, but Snowden in the end started to say some things. But they didn't want Snowden to be talking about U.S. intelligence on a Russian platform too. They won't extradite Assad to Jelani, of course, but at the same time, they don't want him to be using Moscow as a platform for raising a new resistance front. There are, by the way, people who are talking about resistance fronts in Syria, but they're quite weak and divided at the moment. It's nothing substantial. And if you ask people in there, what is this group, the Islamic Resistance or whatever it is, are doing, and they say that we haven't heard of them. So the Druze are the best organized and armed, but they're small and isolated, and many of them are inclined to look for Israeli support because the Druze in occupied Palestine have some sort of relationship with the Israelis. But the others, they're quite divided. The Alawis are very divided. They're intimidated by the reprisals against civilians, the civilian massacres there in March, where thousands were killed. So there isn't leadership at the moment. There isn't organization of resistance. But is that to say resistance doesn't exist, or there aren't patriotic Syrians who would like to see a secular pluralist state back again? I'm sure that they would prefer to have a pluralist state rather than than Jelani's regime, because there isn't a minority they haven't attacked. They attacked the Ismailis recently, the Aga Khan Foundation. So they've attacked the Shia. They've suicide bombed a Christian church. They attacked Sweda. They massacred the Alawis. There's really and a number of the Sunni people individually feel threatened now because people have their pictures taken with people in the government or the army before, and that they are chasing up and doing witch hunts of people for that too.
Wow, Jesus, I cannot wrap my head around.
I tried to get some people to talk from Syria, and there's a great sense of intimidation. They really don't want to speak out at the moment. It's very, very difficult for them. They think it's very, very dangerous for them to speak, just to talk about what's going on.
It is. I mean, it really is. I mean, these guys are animals. I mean, like, I cannot imagine being in a situation where you have somewhat of a secular government. You're on the beach in bikinis, and then a week later, you can get killed doing anything like it. Meaning your reality just changes
Yeah.
overnight, on a dime. I cannot.
Well, a journalist, and she wanted to get her passport renewed, and they said, "Come in, we want to do an investigation." I said, "Get out, because she could just go into the office and they say you were doing propaganda for Assad. Bang, that's it, or she's in jail or she's dead, basically." So a lot of people are still trying to leave the country in that way, but they're tied down because one, it's expensive, and two, they've got elderly parents and so on. So it's not that simple but a lot of people are looking to leave the country still.
I guess the last question is Erdogan. Where does he fit into this? I mean, for all intents and purposes, he was trying to build some kind of air defense in Syria. Israel bombed it. You have the situation now where, because of, I guess, the Balkanization of Syria, that Israel is rubbing up against Turkish borders in a way that they weren't prior. That can't be a good outcome for Erdogan. As you point out, he's a NATO country, but I don't get the sense that NATO is going to come to his assistance if Israel bombs Turkey. Yeah. Give me your take on that, and this could be the last question.
Well, the Israelis are definitely competing for influence. I mean, they're not on the border, but they're certainly undermining Turkey's attempt to establish some sort of regime based around Jolani. Erdogan put a lot of investment into, of course, he was helped by the Qataris, who are the money bags in the Muslim Brotherhood network there, but he invested a lot in a lot of these groups, including the foreign groups, including the Uyghurs from China, who are still in South Turkey, and also now down on the coast, trying to steal land, particularly from the Alawis and so on. And being given a mission, by the way, Jolani has a mission for a lot of the foreign fighters there to actually go and fight Hezbollah in Lebanon. But this assumes that maybe there's going to be an Israeli invasion. They're going to play some support role to the Israelis invading from the east side into the Bekaa Valley, which hasn't been done before. But Erdogan doesn't have that same obsession with Hezbollah, but he would like to extend his influence. But now he finds himself competing with the Israelis, and he's not ready to attack the Israelis. He's not ready to take them on in that sort of way. As you say, he's not going to feel confident that he's got the backing of the European NATO members in the way that the Israelis do.
To be honest with you, part of me slightly wants Israel to go rogue and hit Turkey just so they know what they are.
They're talking
Meaning
about
when NATO doesn't come to their rescue. And
some of them are talking about it.
Yeah.
They're talking about that because they say that once we get rid of Iran, there goes the Shia component of the so-called axis of resistance. And then we've got the Muslim Brotherhood influence to deal with, because Qatar was Muslim Brotherhood and Erdogan's Muslim Brotherhood. So they know, they're aware that they're clever. They know that that's another network, an important network. Hamas used to be part of it. It's not anymore, really. It's much more allied with Iran than with Qatar and Turkey these days. But so they're talking in those sorts of terms. But that's just this arrogance that comes from impunity. We'll do anything. One of the ministers, what's his name, Smotrich, is saying, we want Damascus. Damascus belongs to us, So they're saying all sorts of things now because they're emboldened by Washington. Washington just keeps giving them everything, basically. Biden wouldn't pull them up at all, and Trump just uses cruder language, which emboldens them further.
Yeah. Tim, you are fantastic. This was an awesome breakdown. Thank you for this. Honestly, I always appreciate your analysis, and you are sincerely good at it. Thank you. Tim Anderson. He is writer, internationalist, academic, director of Center for Hegemonic Studies. You can find him, Center for Counter Hegemonic Studies. And you can find his website, counterhegemonicstudies.site. Tim, thank you for this. By the way, is there anywhere else that people can find you, just in case I'm missing something?
Well, on Twitter, X, I suppose.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. And you're under Tim Anderson on Twitter. So
yeah.
You have a fantastic rest of your night. Thank you for this.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. All right. That was a great breakdown by